Is she worth the kingdom, David? Lisa's voice didn't tremble. It was a terrifyingly calm whisper that echoed through the vast, shadowed expanse of their royal bedchamber. Alpha King David stood frozen by the grand fireplace. The lingering scent of jasmine and rain, the signature perfume of Elena, the widow of his most loyal general who had bled out on the northern border just weeks ago, still clung sickeningly to his skin. Lisa, it meant nothing. He breathed, the lie tasting like ash. She was grieving. I was weak. Her beauty, Her beauty cost you your wife, Lisa interrupted smoothly. She slipped the heavy platinum mate's ring from her finger. The metal clanked against the glass table, ringing out like a judge's gavel. You desired to possess a grieving widow, but what you've truly done is forfeit a queen. The silence that followed the dropping of the ring was absolute. It pressed against the walls of the chamber, thick and suffocating. David stared at the small band of platinum resting on the glass, the symbol of their union looking absurdly small, for the sheer weight of the devastation it had just unleashed. He looked at Lisa. She was not crying. That was the most terrifying part. Had she screamed? Had she thrown the Ming vases that lined the corridor? Had she raked her nails across his chest? He could have handled it. He could have fought back, reasoned, apologized, or subdued her with the overwhelming presence of his alpha aura. But Lisa's aura, normally a warm, enveloping gold that anchored his volatile power, had completely retracted. She was entirely closed off. A fortress. Lisa, David started, taking a step forward, his hand outstretched. Please. It was a lapse in judgment. General Marcus died on the border. Elena was brought to the palace for her protection. I looked at her and... He trailed off, the truth too ugly to articulate in the presence of his wife. He didn't need to finish. Lisa knew. She had seen the way David looked at the widow when Elena first arrived at the court, draped in mourning black that only served to accentuate her startling, ethereal beauty. She possessed a fragile, tragic allure, pale skin, tear-filled doe eyes, and a vulnerability that demanded a protector. David, an alpha hardwired to conquer and protect, had been drawn to her like a moth to a flame. He hadn't loved Elena. Lisa knew that. He'd simply wanted to possess her, to conquer the beautiful tragedy that had been dropped onto his doorstep. You looked at her. Lisa finished for him, her tone clinical. And you decided that your vows, our bond, and the respect owed to a man who died defending your borders were secondary to your appetite. She turned away from him and walked toward the massive cedar wardrobe. She didn't reach for the silk gowns or the velvet cloaks he'd gifted her over their 5-year reign. Instead, she pulled out a simple, sturdy leather traveling bag. What are you doing? Panic, sharp and icy, finally pierced through David's shock. You can't leave. You are the queen. I was the queen, Lisa corrected, methodically folding a thick wool tunic. A queen rules beside a king of honor. You are just a man who takes what he wants because he can. I won't share a throne with a man I can no longer respect. Her movements were precise, betraying none of the internal shattering David knew must be happening. The mate bond they shared, usually a humming current of shared emotion, felt frayed, snapping thread by thread. He felt her pain, a deep, resonant ache, but it was heavily shielded by an ironclad resolve. I won't let you go, David growled, his voice dropping an octave as his wolf pushed to the surface, demanding control over the slipping situation. Guards, don't, Lisa snapped, turning her head just slightly. Her eyes, usually a soft hazel, were flinty and cold. If you summon the guards to keep me here by force, David, I will strip you of your dignity in front of them. I will tell them exactly why I am leaving. I will tell them how their king repays the men who die for him by crawling into their widows' beds. David choked on his next breath. The political fallout of such a revelation would be catastrophic. The military was already on edge after Marcus's death. If they knew their alpha had dishonored Marcus's memory so basely, there would be a rebellion. He took a step back, the fight draining from him, replaced by a hollow, gnawing horror. He had thought himself invincible. He was the Alpha King. He took what he desired. But watching Lisa zip the leather bag, tossing a modest gray cloak over her shoulders, he realized the true cost of his arrogance. Without another word, without a backward glance, Lisa walked past him. The draft from the heavy oak doors swinging open chilled the sweat on David's bare chest. He was left alone with the scent of another woman, staring at the ring on the table, realizing he had just lost the only thing of true value in his kingdom. The night sky over the capital was a bruised, weeping purple. Heavy rain lashed against the cobblestone courtyard, turning the stone slick and treacherous. Lisa pulled the hood of her gray cloak up, the thick wool immediately growing heavy with the downpour. She walked with purpose toward the outer gates. Her heart, which had held steady through the confrontation in the bedchamber, now began a violent, erratic rhythm against her ribs. Every step away from the palace felt like a physical tearing of flesh. She loved David. That was the tragedy of it all. Despite his arrogance, despite his dominant nature, she had loved the man beneath the crown. But she loved herself more. She possessed a brilliant, tactical mind, one that had organized his supply lines, brokered his peace treaties, and managed his court while he basked in the glory of leadership. She refused to reduce herself to a blind, forgiving accessory. My queen. A large figure stepped out from the shadows of the final portcullis. It was Silas, the captain of the gate. His armor gleamed faintly in the sparse torchlight, the rain running in rivulets down his scarred face. Lisa paused. I am no longer your queen, Silas. Step aside. Silas looked at the small leather bag in her hand, then up toward the highest tower of the palace, where the lights of the royal bedchambers still burned. His jaw tightened. He had served Lisa directly for 3 years. He knew her character, her grace, and her strategic genius. He also knew the rumors that had been whispering through the servants' quarters about the grieving widow in the East Wing. Silas didn't ask questions. He didn't demand royal decrees or travel papers. He simply bowed, a deep, reverent gesture that spoke louder than any words of loyalty, and signaled the men in the gatehouse. The massive iron gears groaned, and the heavy portcullis began to lift. Safe travels, Lady Lisa. Silas murmured over the roar of the rain. May the goddess guide your path. Thank you, Silas. Look after the men, she replied softly, stepping out into the unforgiving night. Back in the palace, David stood in the center of the East Wing. He had bypassed his own chambers, driven by a chaotic mix of anger, grief, and a desperate need to blame someone else for his own actions. He pushed open the door to Elena's suite without knocking. Elena was seated by the fire, brushing her long, raven hair. She looked up, her dark eyes widening in a picture of perfect, fragile innocence. She wore a thin, silk nightgown that clung to her curves, a stark contrast to the heavy mourning clothes she wore by day. My king, she breathed, setting the brush down and rising gracefully. You've returned to me so soon. She crossed the room, reaching out to lay a pale hand on his chest. Yesterday, that touch had ignited a wild, consuming fire in his blood, a primal urge to claim and protect. Tonight, her touch felt like ice. It felt like ash. It felt like poison. David violently flinched, stepping back so quickly Elena stumbled. "Don't," he snarled, the sound low and dangerous. Elena's face fell, genuine confusion masking her beautiful features. "David, what is wrong? Did she find out?" "She's gone," David said, his voice cracking, the reality of it finally breaking through his shock. He looked at Elena, really looked at her. He stripped away the allure, the vulnerability, the physical perfection. He saw a woman who had willingly received another man in her bed, while her husband's blood was barely dry on the battlefield. And worse, he saw his own reflection in her eyes. A man who had thrown away a diamond to pick up a glittering piece of glass. "She left," he repeated, backing toward the door. "Get out of my sight. If you are still in this palace by sunrise, I will throw you in the dungeons myself." He turned and fled the room, leaving the beautiful widow standing in stunned silence, the illusion of their illicit romance shattered by the devastating weight of real consequences. 3 weeks later, the neutral zone was a vast, unforgiving expanse of ancient forests and jagged ravines that separated David's territory from the western ridge. It was a place of lawlessness, inhabited by rogues, exiles, and beasts that cared nothing for borders or treaties. Alpha King, Julian of the western ridge, moved silently through the dense underbrush. He was a stark contrast to David. Where David was polished marble and explosive power, Julian was tempered steel and calculating silence. He wore dark leathers that blended with the shadows, a composite bow gripped loosely in his scarred hand. He was hunting a massive rogue bear that had been terrorizing his border patrols. But his sharp senses had picked up something entirely different on the wind. Not a bear, a wolf. But the scent was strange. It lacked the feral, unwashed musk of a rogue, carrying instead faint, faded notes of something elegant. Lavender and old parchment, buried under layers of dirt, pine needles, and wood smoke. He signaled his 2 massive hunting hounds, Brutus and Cassius, to halt. The dogs froze, whining softly, their noses twitching. Julian crept forward, peering through a thicket of thorns into a small clearing. What he saw stopped the breath in his lungs. It wasn't a threat, it was a woman. She was kneeling in the mud beside a small stream, gutting a wild hare with a small, unadorned hunting knife. She wore a stained gray cloak, the hem caked in mud, her hair tied back in a messy, practical braid. She was beautiful, yes, with sharp, aristocratic cheekbones and a strong jaw. But it wasn't her physical appearance that kept Julian rooted to the spot. It was what she was doing. Around the perimeter of her small camp, he noticed tripwires strung between the trees, perfectly camouflaged by fallen leaves. She had positioned her fire pit in a slight depression, masking the glow and dissipating the smoke through the canopy to avoid detection. Even the way she knelt, balanced on the balls of her feet, weapon ready, ears pivoting slightly toward the rustle of the wind, spoke of intense awareness. She wasn't just surviving in the harshest territory on the continent, she was mastering it. Suddenly, a twig snapped under Julian's boot. It was a rookie mistake, born of his sheer distraction. Instantly, the woman moved. She didn't scream or scramble backward. In one fluid motion, she wiped the knife on her boot, stood, and kicked a small pile of damp dirt directly over her smoldering fire, plunging the clearing into heavy dusk shadows. She faded into the tree line with the silence of a ghost. Julian's hounds barked, breaking their hold, and lunged into the clearing. "No," Julian commanded, stepping out of the thicket. The dogs ignored him, bounding toward the spot where the woman had vanished. Suddenly, a sharp thwack echoed through the trees. Brutus yelped as a heavy branch, triggered by a release mechanism Julian hadn't even seen, swung down and blocked the dog's path. sending him tumbling backward. It didn't injure the hound, but it effectively trapped him in a tangle of vines. A heartbeat later, Cassius froze, growling low. Julian stepped into the clearing, raising his hands, his bow held casually to show he wasn't taking aim. "Impressive," he called out, his deep voice carrying through the damp air. "Most rogues run blindly. You corralled my hounds without shedding a drop of their blood. A snare mechanism utilizing the tension of a young oak?" Silence answered him. "I am Julian, Alpha of the Western Ridge," he continued, eyes scanning the canopy. He knew she was watching him. He could feel the weight of her gaze. "I am not here to hunt you. I'm tracking a bear." From the shadows of a massive elm, about 20 yards away, a figure stepped half into the dim light. She kept her hood down, revealing eyes that were guarded, intelligent, and completely devoid of fear. "Your bear is 3 miles east," a crisp, cultured voice rang out. "He favors the berry patches near the sulfur springs. I suggest you leash your dogs, Alpha Julian, before they trigger a trap intended for something much larger than them." Julian stared at her, a slow, fascinated smile spreading across his face. He had met queens, diplomats, and warriors. He had never met anyone quite like the muddy, brilliant woman standing before him. "And who do I have the pleasure of thanking for the tracking advice?" Julian asked, taking a slow step forward. Lisa held her ground, her chin lifting slightly. The title of queen was gone, but the authority remained. "My name is Lisa, and you are standing on my tripwire." Julian froze, his gaze dropping to the toe of his heavy leather boot. A hair-thin cord, woven from dried pine bark and what looked like rabbit sinew, was pulled taut against the dark leather. It was barely visible against the damp earth. He didn't move a muscle, but a low, genuine chuckle rumbled in his chest. It had been years since anyone had gotten the drop on him, let alone in the wild. "A counterweight drop?" he asked, his voice steady. "Or a simple noisemaker to alert the rest of your phantom camp?" "A snare," Lisa replied, her voice smooth and unbothered. "Designed to hoist a 300-pound boar by its hind legs. If you shift your weight, Alpha Julian, you will spend the next few hours dangling upside down from that elm." Julian's eyes danced with amusement. Slowly, with agonizing precision, he shifted his weight to his back foot, using the tip of his bow to press the wire down into the mud before sliding his boot free. The wire snapped back, triggering a heavy counterweight high in the canopy that brought a thick, braided noose whipping through the air to snap empty exactly where he had been standing. "Brilliant," Julian murmured, genuinely impressed. He slung his bow over his shoulder, a universal gesture of peace. "You are clearly no rogue, Lisa. A rogue would have tried to gut me while I was distracted. And you are no simple traveler either. That knife is standard military-issue northern border design, high-carbon steel." Lisa's eyes narrowed slightly, but she gave nothing away. "I am a woman surviving in a forest, Julian. My origins are my own." "Fair enough," he conceded, taking a step back to give her space. The hounds, finally sensing that the tension had broken, trotted over to sniff the mud near her boots. She didn't flinch, merely allowing Cassius to press his wet nose against her hand before she gently scratched behind his ears. Julian watched the interaction, a strange warmth blooming in his chest. She was guarded, lethal, and yet possessed a quiet grace that even his war dogs recognized. The sulfur springs are miles away. Night is falling, and a storm is rolling in over the ridge. My camp is a mile west. You are welcome to the fire. No strings attached, no tripwires either. Lisa looked at the darkening sky. The temperature was already dropping, carrying the bitter bite of early winter. She looked back at Julian. His aura wasn't oppressive like David's. It was a steady, contained heat. A shield, not a weapon. "Lead the way," she said simply. Miles away, in the heart of the Eastern Territory, the Royal Council chamber was suffocatingly warm. Alpha King David sat at the head of the massive obsidian table, his knuckles white as he gripped the armrests of his chair. The room was filled with his top military commanders, and the atmosphere was toxic. "With respect, sire." General Vance, a grizzled veteran with a missing eye, slammed a heavy fist onto the table, rattling the silver goblets. "We need answers. General Marcus died a hero. His widow, Elena, was brought here for sanctuary. Now, she vanishes in the middle of the night, disgraced. And Queen Lisa is gone. The men are talking. The rumors. The rumors are treasonous," David snarled, his Alpha Command lashing out, forcing several of the younger commanders to lower their heads. But Vance, hardened by decades of war, merely narrowed his remaining eye. "Treasonous or not, they are affecting morale," Vance countered smoothly. "Furthermore, the winter supply shipments from the agricultural sectors are stalled. Queen Lisa personally managed the ledgers. Without her authorization seals, the merchants are refusing to move the grain. We are looking at a 30% shortfall in the northern garrisons by first snow." David felt a cold sweat break out on the back of his neck. He had spent his entire reign focused on military conquest and border expansion, leaving the labyrinthine complexities of trade, agriculture, and internal diplomacy entirely to Lisa. He hadn't just lost a mate, he had lost the architect of his kingdom's stability. "The Queen has taken a leave of absence to mourn the losses at the border," David lied, the words tasting like copper. "I will sign the ledgers myself." Vance didn't look convinced. None of them did. The absence of Lisa's calming golden aura in the palace was obvious. The castle felt cold, hollow, and terribly fragile. When the council finally dismissed, David retreated to Lisa's private study. He stood in the center of the room, breathing in the fading scent of jasmine and old parchment. The desk was meticulously organized. Maps, trade agreements, and supply routes were color-coded and annotated in her elegant script. He picked up a pen she had left resting on an inkwell. His hand trembled. He had thrown away a kingdom for a fleeting moment of lust. He slammed the pen down, dark ink splattering across a map of the neutral zone. "Commander," David called out, his voice raw. His head of intelligence stepped from the shadows of the corridor. "Send the elite trackers. Strip them of royal insignia. Find my wife. Do not return without her." The fire crackled merrily in Julian's camp. A well-hidden enclave tucked beneath the natural overhang of a limestone cliff. The storm broke overhead, rain sheeting down like a waterfall just feet from where they sat. Completely dry. Julian handed Lisa a tin cup of hot chicory coffee and a piece of dried venison. She accepted it with a nod of thanks, her movements precise and economical. "So," Julian began, leaning back against his saddle, watching the firelight play across her striking features. A northern military blade, an understanding of complex pulley systems, and an accent that suggests high court education. Yet, you are eating hardtack in the neutral zone. Did you anger a king, Lisa? Lisa took a slow sip of the bitter coffee, her hazel eyes reflecting the flames. Something like that. "He must be a fool," Julian said softly. Lisa almost laughed, a bitter, short sound. "He is an alpha. Arrogance often masquerades as foolishness." She looked around the camp, her gaze analytical. You travel light for an alpha king. 2 hounds, a bow, no royal guard. Your borders must be incredibly secure, or you are reckless. Julian smirked, tossing a piece of meat to Brutus. I prefer to know my land personally. A guard changes the dynamic of the forest. The animals hide, the rogues scatter, and you learn nothing. True, Lisa agreed, but your Western trade routes suffer for it. You focus too heavily on border security and neglect the interior infrastructure. Julian stopped chewing. He stared at her, caught completely off guard. Excuse me? Lisa set the tin cup down, using a twig to draw in the loose dirt between them. I saw your supply wagon struggling through the mud 3 miles back. Your carts are built wide for the plains, but the western ridge is mountainous. You lose 15% of your grain to overturned carts on the switchbacks alone. If you narrowed the axles by 6 inches and reinforced the wheels with iron bands forged in the southern valleys, you would cut your transport time in half and eliminate the grain loss. Julian was silent. He looked at the crude drawing in the dirt, then up at the woman sitting across from him. His council of elders had been arguing over the grain losses for 6 months. They had blamed bandits, weather, and poor crops. It took this stranger one afternoon of walking through his territory to diagnose the structural flaw in his economy. Who are you? Julian breathed, the question devoid of playfulness this time. It was a demand born of profound awe. He didn't smell a mate bond. He didn't feel the magical pull that legend spoke of. What he felt was far more potent, far more dangerous. He felt a total, consuming fascination. He was looking at an equal, a mind that matched his own. I am a woman who pays attention. Lisa deflected, wiping the dirt away with her boot. She pulled her cloak tighter around her shoulders. You should get some sleep, Alpha Julian. If your bear is at the sulfur springs, he will be agitated. The fumes make them aggressive. Julian didn't push. He recognized the iron walls she had built around herself. But as he lay down on his bedroll, listening to the steady breathing of the woman across the fire, he made a silent vow. Whoever this woman was, whatever past she was running from, he was going to offer her a future in the West. The attack came just before dawn. The rain had stopped, leaving the forest floor silent and choked with a thick, heavy mist. Julian was awake, brewing tea, when Cassius suddenly shot to his feet, a vicious, guttural snarl ripping from his throat. Before Julian could reach his bow, the tree line exploded. It wasn't just a bear. It was a massive, scarred monstrosity, driven mad by the toxic sulfur springs and starvation. It stood 8 feet tall on its hind legs, its fur matted with dried mud and old blood. With a terrifying roar, the beast charged, bypassing Julian entirely. It was making a straight line for the hounds. Cassius, Brutus, flank! Julian roared, diving for his weapon. The dogs scattered, but the bear was unnaturally fast. It swiped a massive paw, catching Brutus on the flank and sending the hound crashing into the limestone wall with a sickening thud. Julian knocked an arrow, drawing the string back to his cheek, but the bear was thrashing wildly, and he couldn't get a clean shot at its heart without risking hitting his dog. Suddenly, a blur of gray motion darted from the shadows of the overhang. Lisa didn't run away. She ran directly into the chaos. In her hand, she held a thick, burning branch she had snatched from the fire. As the bear lunged for Brutus again, Lisa vaulted over a fallen log, swinging the burning wood with all her might. The fiery brand smashed across the bear's snout, raining a shower of orange sparks over its eyes. The beast roared in agony, blinded and disoriented, rearing up on its hind legs and exposing its massive chest. Now! Lisa screamed, diving into the mud, sliding directly under the bear's swinging claws. Julian released the bowstring. The heavy, steel-tipped arrow sang through the damp air, burying itself deep into the center of the bear's chest, right up to the fletching. The monster choked, swaying for a terrifying second before collapsing backward, the earth shaking under its immense weight. Silence descended on the camp, broken only by the heavy panting of the hounds and the crackle of the fire. Julian dropped his bow and ran to Lisa. She was already on her knees beside Brutus, her hands quickly but gently examining the bleeding gash on the dog's flank. "He'll live," she said, her voice remarkably steady, though her chest heaved with exertion. "It's a superficial tear. Needs stitching and yarrow root to prevent infection." Julian stared down at her. She was covered in mud, her hair escaping her braid in wild strands, her hands stained with dirt and blood. She was the most magnificent creature he had ever seen. "You didn't run," Julian said, his voice thick with emotion. Lisa didn't look up, carefully applying pressure to the dog's wound with a clean piece of linen from her pack. "You shared your fire. I don't abandon my allies." Julian dropped to his knees beside her. He reached out, his large, calloused hand gently brushing a streak of mud from her cheek. She stiffened, but she didn't pull away. "Lisa," Julian said, his eyes locking onto hers, "come back to the Western Ridge with me. Not as a guest. Come as my lead strategist. My court needs a mind like yours. I need a mind like yours." Lisa looked at him. For the first time, the walls in her eyes wavered. She saw genuine respect in Julian's gaze. No desire to possess, no need to conquer, just an offer of partnership. Before she could form a reply, a sharp whistle pierced the morning mist. Julian's head snapped up. 3 of his border scouts dropped silently from the trees at the edge of the clearing. They were breathing hard, their expressions grim. "Alpha," the lead scout said, bowing quickly. "Forgive the intrusion. We tracked you through the storm. We have a breach." Julian stood up, his demeanor instantly shifting from a man mesmerized to a king preparing for war. "Rogues?" "No, sire," the scout replied, casting a wary glance at Lisa, who had slowly risen to her feet. "Elite trackers, Eastern faction. They bear no royal crests, but we recognize their tactics. They crossed into the neutral zone by moonlight." Julian frowned. "David's men? What are they doing this far west? Are they tracking a defector?" "We intercepted one of their forward scouts," the man reported, his voice dropping. "They aren't looking for a defector, sire. They are looking for a woman." The temperature in the clearing seemed to plummet. Julian slowly turned his head, his gaze landing on Lisa. She stood perfectly still, her face drained of color, her hand resting instinctively on the hilt of her blade. The pieces fell into place with devastating clarity. The high court accent, the brilliant tactical mind, the pristine military blade, the deep, unspoken betrayal that had driven her into the wilderness. King David hadn't just lost a wife. He had lost Queen Lisa. "It's you," Julian whispered, the revelation hitting him like a physical blow. "You're the Queen of the East." The heavy mist clinging to the limestone cliffs seemed to freeze. The words of the scout hung in the damp air, echoing with catastrophic implications. Queen of the East. Julian's silver eyes remained locked on Lisa. Her hand was wrapped so tightly around the hilt of her northern blade that her knuckles were entirely white. She wasn't looking at the scouts. She was watching Julian, her body coiled like a spring, calculating exactly how long it would take to draw her weapon and disappear back into the brutal wilderness. She fully expected him to hand her over. A runaway queen was a geopolitical nightmare, a guaranteed spark that could ignite a continental war. "Stand down, Lisa," Julian said, his voice a low, soothing rumble that cut through the sharp edge of her panic. He didn't move toward her, ensuring he didn't trigger her fight-or-flight instincts. "I won't go back," she stated, her voice devoid of fear, but laced with a lethal, absolute certainty. "If you try to hold me for David's men, Julian, I will bleed you." A faint, incredibly genuine smile touched the corner of Julian's mouth. "I don't doubt that for a second. But you misunderstand the West, my brilliant strategist. We don't trade our guests to tyrants to buy peace." He turned his back on her, an ultimate display of trust from an alpha, and looked up at his lead scout. "How many in the tracker unit?" "A dozen, sire," the scout replied, dropping lightly from the lower branches to the muddy earth. "Heavily armed. They are moving fast. They'll be on the perimeter of this clearing in less than 3 minutes." "Form a perimeter," Julian commanded. His demeanor had shifted entirely. The relaxed hunter was gone, replaced by a legendary warlord. "Knock arrows, but hold your fire. I want them to see us before they act." Within seconds, Julian's 3 scouts vanished into the canopy, becoming entirely invisible among the wet leaves and heavy timber. Julian reached down, pulling a heavy, double-bladed broadsword from his saddlebags. He planted the tip into the mud, resting his hands casually on the pommel, and waited. He didn't ask Lisa to hide. He knew she would refuse. The silence of the forest was abruptly broken by the snapping of branches and the heavy, synchronized thud of armored boots. From the dense thicket to the east, 12 men emerged. They wore unmarked dark leather, but their disciplined formation and the quality of their steel practically screamed Royal Guard. At their head was a man with a jagged scar across his chin, Captain Thorn, David's most ruthless tracker. Thorn stepped into the clearing, his eyes instantly locking onto Lisa. Relief washed over his hardened features, quickly followed by a smug arrogance. But his stride faltered when his gaze shifted to the massive, imposing figure of Alpha Julian, standing directly in his path, leaning casually on a sword that was taller than most men. "Hold," Thorn commanded his men, his voice tight. He recognized the man standing before him. Every soldier on the continent knew the face of the Western King. "Alpha Julian, we did not expect to find you this far into the neutral zone." "I was hunting a bear," Julian replied smoothly, his tone conversational, but his eyes glacial. "But it seems the woods are infested with rats this morning." "You are a long way from the Eastern Plains, Captain." Thorn straightened, trying to project authority. "We are on an official retrieval mission by direct order of King David. The woman behind you is the Queen of the East. She is to be escorted back to the capital immediately. Step aside, Alpha, and let us pass. This is an internal Eastern matter." Julian didn't move a muscle. "This is the neutral zone, and this woman is sharing my fire. That makes her my guest. And in the West, we are highly protective of our guests." Thorn scowled, signaling his men to fan out. "Don't interfere, Julian. You want to start a war over a domestic dispute? King David will march his entire vanguard to your borders if you harbor her." "Let him march," Julian said softly. The casualness was gone. His alpha aura, a terrifying, freezing weight, suddenly slammed down on the clearing. It didn't force submission. It instilled absolute terror. Even the hound stopped panting. "Tell King David that if a single Eastern soldier steps foot on Western soil, I will turn your vanguard into fertilizer for my spring crops." Thorn swallowed hard, his hand hovering over his sword. "You would risk your kingdom for a woman you just met?" Before Julian could answer, Lisa stepped out from the shadow of the cliff overhang. She didn't stand behind Julian. She stood shoulder to shoulder with him, He isn't risking his kingdom for me, Thorn, Lisa said, her voice ringing with the absolute authority of a born ruler. He is protecting a sovereign border, something David has forgotten how to do. Go back to your master. Tell him I am alive, tell him I am gone, and tell him if he ever sends men to hunt me again, I will send them back in boxes. Thorn looked from the icy wrath in Julian's eyes to the unyielding iron in Lisa's. He knew Julian's archers had them surrounded. He could feel the crosshairs on the back of his neck. This isn't over, Thorn spat, taking a slow step backward. The king will come for you himself. I'll put the kettle on, Julian replied dryly. As the trackers melted back into the eastern woods, Julian turned to Lisa. He offered her his hand. Shall we go to the west? We have supply routes to fix. Lisa looked at his outstretched hand, then up into his honest, intelligent eyes. For the first time in weeks, she smiled. She took his hand. Lead the way. The Grand Council chamber of the Eastern Palace was freezing. It wasn't just the early winter frost creeping through the heavy stone walls. It was the chilling reality of a kingdom rapidly spinning out of control. Alpha King David paced frantically before the grand hearth, his eyes bloodshot, his imposing figure looking strangely hollow. For 3 weeks, he had tried to ignore the gaping wound Lisa's departure had left in his administration. He had tried to rule through intimidation and brute force, the only languages he truly understood. It had been a catastrophic failure. Sire, the situation in the agricultural sector is no longer tenable, General Vance said, his singular eye fixed firmly on the king. He stood at the end of the obsidian table, clutching a stack of heavily annotated ledgers. Without the Queen's cipher, the merchant guilds refuse to release the grain reserves. They believe the crown is insolvent. We had a bread riot in the lower districts this morning. Crush the riot, David roared, spinning around to face his general. Send the palace guard. Hang the ringleaders. I will not be questioned by bakers and farmers. Vance didn't flinch. He slowly set the ledgers down. If you hang the farmers, sire, who will harvest the winter wheat? You cannot stab a famine into submission. David's chest heaved. He ran a trembling hand through his dark hair. The scent of Elena, the widow who had been the catalyst of his ruin, had been entirely scrubbed from the palace. He had banished her to a remote convent the morning after Lisa left, unable to bear the sight of the woman who reminded him of his profound stupidity. But removing Elena hadn't brought Lisa back. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors of the council chamber slammed open. Captain Thorn marched in, his armor caked in mud, his face grim. He dropped to one knee before the king. Sire, we found her. David froze. The breath rushed from his lungs in a desperate gasp. Lisa, is she safe? Where is she? She is alive, sire, Thorn reported, keeping his eyes on the stone floor. We tracked her deep into the neutral zone, but we could not retrieve her. David's eyes narrowed, his alpha aura flaring in a violent, oppressive burst that made the younger commanders in the room choke on the air. You took 12 elite guards to apprehend one unescorted woman and you failed? Did you lose her trail? No, sire, Thorn said, his voice tightening. She was not unescorted. We found her in the company of Alpha King Julian of the Western Ridge. A heavy, deathly silence fell over the chamber. General Vance slowly closed his remaining eye, a quiet groan escaping his lips. It was the worst possible news. Julian? David whispered, the name tasting like bile. What was she doing with Julian? Did he take her hostage? Is he demanding a ransom? With respect, sire. Thorn swallowed hard, dreading his next words. She did not appear to be a hostage. They fought off a rogue bear together. When we ordered her to return, Alpha Julian threatened to slaughter the vanguard if we crossed his borders. And the Queen herself told us to return. Liar, David bellowed, sweeping a silver candelabra off the table with a violent backhand. It crashed against the stone, sending hot wax flying. She is my mate. She is the Queen of the East. He has manipulated her. He has used some Western sorcery to cloud her mind. The pure, unfiltered delusion in David's voice made Vance's blood run cold. The king was projecting. He could not accept that his wife had simply chosen to walk away from a broken vow, so he invented a villain to direct his rage toward. "Mobilize the vanguard," David ordered, his voice dropping to a terrifying guttural snarl. He marched toward the weapons rack on the wall, grabbing his heavy broadsword. "Summon the heavy cavalry. We march on the western ridge at first light." Madness! Vance finally snapped, slamming his fists onto the table. Decades of military discipline dissolved in the face of absolute disaster. You cannot march our army into the mountains in the dead of winter. Julian's forces are rested, well-fed, and fighting on their home terrain. Our men are starving, demoralized, and whispering about a cursed king. It will be a slaughter. David crossed the room in 3 massive strides, grabbing Vance by the throat and slamming the grizzled general against the stone wall. The king's eyes were entirely feral, glowing with an unhinged, possessive yellow light. "I am the king," David hissed, his fangs extending slightly. "She is my property, and I will burn the entire western ridge to ash to take back what belongs to me." "Am I understood, General?" Vance choked, staring into the eyes of a man who had completely lost his mind. He offered a stiff, barely perceptible nod. David dropped him, turning back to the terrified room. "Prepare the men. We ride for war." The war room in the highest tower of the Western Palace was bathed in warm, golden sunlight. The air smelled of sharp pine and rich, dark coffee. Lisa stood over a massive parchment map, a compass in one hand and a piece of charcoal in the other. She wore a tailored tunic of deep forest green, her hair braided with silver beads. The exhausted, mud-covered fugitive from the woods was gone. She was radiant, energized by the profound respect and freedom she had found in Julian's court. "If we reroute the timber shipments through the lower switchbacks," Lisa murmured, rapidly tracing a line across the map, "we bypass the frost lines entirely. It adds 2 days to the journey, but it guarantees the shipments won't be lost to avalanches." Julian leaned against the heavy oak table, his arms crossed over his chest, watching her with a gaze so intensely focused it made her skin tingle. He wasn't looking at the map. He was looking at her. "You've been here 3 weeks, Lisa," Julian said softly. "You've completely restructured our trade agreements, doubled the efficiency of our grain silos, and somehow managed to charm my hounds into sleeping at the foot of your bed." Lisa paused, a faint blush creeping up her neck. She looked up at him. "Is that a complaint, Alpha?" "It's an observation," Julian replied, pushing off the table and taking a slow step toward her. He stopped just inches away, his towering presence offering warmth rather than intimidation. He reached out, his knuckles gently brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "I have spent my life securing my borders, building walls to keep the world out. I never realized how empty my kingdom was until you filled it." Lisa's breath hitched. She didn't feel the suffocating, magical pull of the mate bond she had shared with David. What she felt with Julian was a slow, consuming burn. A fire built on absolute trust, mutual respect, and a terrifyingly deep intellectual connection. "Julian," she whispered, her eyes searching his. Before he could close the distance between them, a blaring, resonant horn blasted through the crisp morning air. It was a harsh, discordant note that vibrated in the stone floors. Julian's romantic haze instantly evaporated. He turned toward the massive arched window, his eyes narrowing. The border alarm. 30 minutes later, Julian and Lisa sat on horseback at the precipice of the Great Divide, the massive stone gorge that marked the official border between the West and the neutral zone. Below them, on the muddy plains, King David's vanguard had arrived. It was a pathetic sight. The Eastern soldiers looked exhausted, their armor dull, their horses shivering in the bitter wind. At the front of the formation sat David, his face pale, his eyes manic and wild. He looked up at the ridge, his gaze locking instantly onto Lisa. "Lisa!" David's voice, magically amplified by his alpha power, boomed across the gorge. "I have come to bring you home. Step away from the Western dog and return to your king." Julian remained perfectly still, his hand resting casually on the pommel of his sword. Behind him, 3,000 elite Western archers stood in absolute silence, their bows ready. Lisa guided her horse forward, stopping at the very edge of the cliff. She looked down at the man she had once loved, the man who had traded their empire for a moment of fleeting lust. She felt nothing but pity. "I am home, David." Lisa's voice carried over the wind, clear and unwavering. She didn't need magic to project her authority. David's face contorted in rage. "You are under a spell. He has manipulated you. I am your mate. The goddess bound us. You cannot break that." "You broke it the moment you dishonored General Marcus's memory in Elena's bed," Lisa countered, her words slicing through the valley like a perfectly honed blade. A murmur of shock rippled through the Eastern army. General Vance, sitting on a black destrier behind David, closed his eyes. The truth was finally out. "Lies!" David screamed, drawing his sword. "Attack! Bring me the king's head!" Not a single Eastern soldier moved. David turned around, his eyes wide with disbelief. "I gave you a command. Charge the ridge." General Vance slowly drew his sword. But he didn't point it at the ridge. He drove the tip of his blade into the muddy earth, bowing his head. Behind him, one by one, the Eastern vanguard followed suit. Thousands of swords sank into the dirt. They would not fight a suicidal war to cover up their king's betrayal. David looked at his army, entirely paralyzed. He turned back to the ridge, his face crumbling in absolute devastating realization. He had lost everything. Not because he was conquered by a superior army, but because he had conquered his own honor. Lisa turned her horse, looking at Julian. The Western king smiled, reaching out to grasp her hand tightly in his. Together, they turned their backs on the broken king of the East, riding back into the warmth and prosperity of a kingdom they would rule as equals. David's desperate grasp for possession ultimately left him with empty hands, a stark reminder that loyalty is earned through honor, not demanded by a crown. While David's kingdom crumbled beneath the weight of his betrayal, Lisa found her true power not in the title she lost, but in the brilliant mind she retained. In Julian, she found a king strong enough to stand beside her rather than in front of her. Their alliance proved that the most unbreakable bonds are forged in mutual respect, intelligence, and the shared courage to walk away from what is broken. If you enjoyed this story of betrayal, brilliant strategy, and ultimate justice, please like, share, and subscribe for more epic tales. Let us know in the comments what you thought of Lisa's final choice.